The courtroom was full that morning. Journalists had their cameras ready, people whispered to one another, and every seat was taken. It was not an ordinary trial. A billionaire businessman, once celebrated for his success, was sitting at the front in the defendant's chair. He had built companies, donated to charities, and appeared on the covers of magazines, but now he was accused of crimes that could destroy everything he had worked for. His wealth, his name, and even his freedom were on the line. He looked tired and pale, his hands resting heavily on the wooden table. His lawyer, the man he had paid millions to represent him, sat beside him at first, flipping through documents nervously. But as the case was called and the judge entered, something unexpected happened. The lawyer stood up, whispered a few words in the billionaire's ear, and then walked out. No explanation, no apology, he simply abandoned him in the middle of court. Gasps filled the room. People could not believe what they were seeing. A billionaire left alone, without legal defense, in front of a judge who was known for being strict and unforgiving. Reporters began writing quickly, sensing this would be the headline of the day. Rivals of the billionaire smiled, whispering to each other that his end had finally come. The billionaire tried to stay calm, but inside he was crushed. He had trusted his lawyer. He had believed money could protect him, that power and influence would always keep him safe. Yet now, in his greatest moment of need, even money had failed. He sat silently, staring at the ground, as the judge asked, "Who is here to represent you?" No one answered. His business partners, once eager to sit by his side, were nowhere to be seen. His so-called friends did not even come to court. People who once shook his hand with smiles now stayed far away, afraid of being connected to his downfall. The courtroom grew cold with silence. The courtroom still buzzed with shock. People could not believe what had just happened. A maid, someone in a plain uniform, had stood up and declared that she would defend the billionaire. The sound of laughter and whispers filled the room, bouncing from wall to wall like restless echoes. Some shook their heads in dismay. The final day of the trial arrived. The air outside the courthouse was heavy with anticipation. By now, the maid's story had spread far and wide. Crowds gathered outside holding signs, some in support, some in doubt. Reporters pushed through the people, shouting questions and trying to capture every glance of the woman who had become a symbol of courage. Richard woke up the morning after the baby's fever with thoughts he could not shake away. The whole night he had stood silently, watching Grace care for his son with a devotion that did not belong to an employee. It belonged to a mother. He had never seen anyone care so much without Bay. The next morning in the mansion felt different, though no one could explain why. Grace went about her work as usual, sweeping the hallways and polishing the silverware. She hummed softly to herself, the same tune she always sang, while the baby crawled around nearby, laughing at her voice. She did not know that her life was about to change. Richard sat quietly at the long dining table, but he was not reading the newspaper like he usually did. Instead, he watched Grace move about the room. Her hands were gentle with the baby, her steps steady though her body was tired. He thought about their conversation in his office the day before. He thought about her brother, studying back in the village, and about her sacrifice working in silence so someone else could dream. After breakfast, Richard called for Grace again. She entered the office nervously, unsure why she was being summoned twice in 2 days. She stood with her hands folded, waiting. Richard gestured for her to sit, and this time she obeyed without hesitation. "Grace," he began, his tone calm but serious, "I owe you more than I can say. For months, I lived under the same roof as you and never truly saw you. I saw only a maid, a worker. But you have shown me something far more powerful than service. You have shown me love, sacrifice, and dignity." Grace lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. "I cannot let that go unnoticed," Richard continued. "From today forward, you will no longer be just a maid in this house. I want you to be the baby's full-time nanny. You will be paid a proper salary, far more than before. You will also have your own private room with comfort and respect. Grace's eyes widened, and her lips trembled. Sir, I don't know what to say. Say nothing, Richard replied. You have already spoken with your actions. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She bowed her head. Thank you, sir. This means more than you know. But Richard was not finished. He leaned forward, his voice softer now. I also want to help your brother. You told me he loves to study. From today, I will set up a scholarship for him. He will never have to worry about school fees again. He will study as far as his dreams can take him. Grace gasped. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. Her hands covered her face as tears spilled freely. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she whispered, Sir, this is too much. I don't deserve this. Richard shook his head. You deserve far more than this. You have given love without asking for anything. That is the highest kind of service, and it is rare. If anyone deserves a chance, it is you and your family. Grace fell to her knees in gratitude, but Richard quickly stood and gently helped her up. No, Grace, he said firmly. Stand tall. You are not just a servant. You are part of this home now. Word spread quickly among the staff. At first, some were surprised, even jealous, but when they thought about it, they realized Richard was right. Grace had always been the heart of the house, though she never asked for recognition. Now, she was finally being honored. That evening, Grace sat on her new bed, holding the letter that confirmed her brother's scholarship. She thought about the little boy back in the village, how his eyes had always shone when he spoke about books and learning. She imagined him opening this letter, his face breaking into the biggest smile. She cried tears of joy, whispering prayers of thanks. Meanwhile, Richard stood in the hallway, looking at the baby asleep in the crib beside her bed. The child's tiny hand still reached out, clutching Grace's finger even in sleep. Richard realized something profound. His son's earliest sense of love and safety was built not on wealth, not on luxury, but on the arms of a humble woman who had nothing yet gave everything. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion began to shift. The other workers looked at Grace with new respect. They saw how the billionaire himself acknowledged her, not just with words but with actions. Even Richard's wife, who had once seen Grace only as staff, began to speak to her more kindly, realizing how much she meant to the family. One afternoon, Richard gathered the household in the garden. The staff stood nervously, unsure why they had been called. Richard held the baby in his arms, but soon the child reached for Grace, and Richard smiled as he handed him over. I want everyone here to understand something, Richard said. This house runs not because of money, but because of people. And sometimes, the greatest strength comes from those we do not notice. Grace is proof of that. She has reminded me what true love and loyalty mean. The staff clapped softly, and Grace stood blushing, still shy. But deep in her heart, she felt something she had not felt in years: pride. Not pride in herself, but pride that her sacrifices had meaning, that someone finally saw her for who she was. Months later, Grace received a letter from her brother. He wrote about how he had been accepted into a good school, how he studied with passion, and how one day he hoped to become a teacher so he could help children in their village. It is because of you, sister, he wrote. You gave up your comfort so I could dream. And now, because of the kindness of others, I can carry this dream forward. Grace read the letter over and over, her tears falling onto the page. She folded it carefully and kept it close to her heart. Richard, too, felt the change in himself. He no longer saw his wealth as the center of his world. He realized that money was only a tool, but the true measure of life was in how much kindness one could give. He began treating all his staff with more fairness, ensuring they had proper rooms, meals, and respect. His friends in the business world noticed the change in him. Some were confused, others admired him. But Richard knew it did not matter. What mattered was that he had finally opened his eyes. As for Grace, she continued her work, but now with a lighter heart. She no longer carried the baby out of duty alone, she carried him with joy, knowing she was valued, knowing her family's future was safe. One night, as she rocked the baby to sleep in the crib beside her bed, she looked at his peaceful face and smiled. She thought of how far she had come from a village girl sleeping on hard floors, to a maid unseen in a mansion, to a woman who had been recognized for her quiet strength. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Thank you, God. Thank you for showing me that even the smallest acts of love can change the world." And outside her room, unseen, Richard paused in the hallway, hearing her words. He smiled, his heart full. The billionaire who once only saw numbers had now learned the value of a humble woman's sacrifice. What had begun with a maid sleeping on the floor with a baby had turned into something far greater, a story of kindness, dignity, and respect that would never be forgotten. Ng asked, without expecting anything in return. It humbled him. Grace woke up earlier than usual that morning. She sat on the edge of her new bed, still amazed by its comfort. For so long she had accepted sleeping on the floor as normal, and now every night felt like a blessing. Yet she did not allow herself to get lost in the feeling. She had work to do, and she knew her life was built on service, not luxury. She folded the sheets neatly, brushed her hair, and stepped out quietly to begin her day. Richard was already awake, sitting in his study with a cup of coffee. He had been thinking all night. The sight of Grace's sacrifice had changed him, and the small kindness of giving her a bed was not enough. He wanted to know more. He wanted to understand her. To him, she had become a mystery, a woman who gave so much love without asking for anything in return. At breakfast, he surprised everyone. Instead of rushing through his meal and leaving for the city, he lingered at the table. Grace moved around the room, serving as usual, but he watched her with quiet attention. The baby reached for her, giggling when she picked him up. Richard noticed how naturally she smiled at the child, how she whispered small words of comfort. She seemed to have a world inside her that no one else saw. Later that afternoon, Richard called the housekeeper. "Send Grace to my office," he said. The housekeeper looked startled. It was unusual for him to summon a maid directly, but she nodded and went. When Grace heard the message, her heart began to pound. She wondered if she had done something wrong. Had she broken a rule? Had someone complained about her? She walked slowly toward the office, her hands trembling. She knocked softly on the heavy wooden door, and when Richard's voice told her to come in, she entered with her head bowed. Richard looked up from his desk. "Sit down, Grace," he said gently. She hesitated, unused to being spoken to in that tone. "Don't be afraid. You're not in trouble," he added. She sat on the edge of the chair, nervous. He studied her for a moment. "Tell me about yourself," he said. Grace blinked in surprise. "About myself, sir? Yes. I've seen how hard you work. I've seen how much care you give to my child. But I know nothing about you. Who are you, Grace? What do you dream of? What do you carry inside your heart?" Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. No one had ever asked her such questions. She was a maid. People gave her orders, not conversations. Finally, she spoke softly. "There isn't much to tell, sir. I came here from a small village. My father passed away when I was young. My mother works in the fields. I have a younger brother. He is smarter than me. He loves books, but school costs money. I came here so I could send money back for his studies." Richard leaned forward, listening carefully. Her voice was quiet, but every word carried weight. She continued, "I don't think of comfort for myself. I think only of him. If he can study, if he can have a better life, then my sacrifices are worth it. There was silence in the room. Richard felt something stir deep in his chest. Her words were simple, but they carried more truth than any speech he had ever heard in a boardroom. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" he asked finally. Grace looked down at her hands. "Because, sir, I came here to work, not to ask. Complaining would not change anything. I only try to do my duty with a full heart. That is all." Richard studied her face. There was no bitterness in her tone, no anger. Only honesty and humility. He had met leaders, politicians, and business giants who carried pride and arrogance, yet here was a woman who carried nothing but dignity, even in hardship. "You've given more to this house than anyone," Richard said quietly. "And yet you've asked for nothing." Grace shook her head. "It is enough for me to serve. The baby, he reminds me of my brother. Caring for him gives me strength." Richard leaned back in his chair, his thoughts heavy. For years, he had measured people by what they could bring to his empire. Yet Grace, with her quiet hands and simple heart, had given more than any of them. She had given love. And love could not be bought. He wanted to say more, but he noticed her nervous eyes. He smiled instead, something he rarely did. "Thank you for telling me, Grace. You may go now." Grace stood, bowed slightly, and walked out, her mind racing. She had never expected such a conversation. She wondered why the billionaire had asked about her life. She wondered if she had spoken too much. But Richard sat at his desk long after she left, unable to focus on his papers. He kept hearing her words, "I don't think of comfort for myself. I think only of him." It was the voice of sacrifice, of quiet strength. That evening, Richard joined his family for dinner. The baby, as usual, reached for Grace, giggling in her arms. His wife noticed but said nothing, though Richard could see she was also grateful for the maid's devotion. Later, as Richard walked alone in the garden, he thought deeply. Grace had changed something inside him. He had begun this week as a businessman, focused on profits. Now, he was thinking about people, about humanity. He wondered how many other Graces existed in the world, unseen, unrecognized, giving silently while others took their sacrifices for granted. The stars shone brightly above, but Richard's heart was restless. He knew one thing, he could no longer ignore Grace. He had to do something not just for her, but because she had reminded him what it meant to be human. And so, silently, Richard made a decision. The next step he would take would change everything for Grace, for her brother, and for the household that had long overlooked her. The baby was safe now, sleeping quietly. Grace, however, had not rested at all. Richard noticed the dark circles under her eyes at breakfast. She moved slower that morning, but she did not complain. She still served him tea, still smiled at the baby, and still hummed softly as she tidied the room. It was as if her own exhaustion did not matter. Richard found himself staring at her again, wondering how much one person could give without breaking. That same day, Richard had a meeting in the city. As he sat at the long glass table with businessmen discussing millions in contracts, his mind drifted again. He compared the greed of men in suits with the quiet sacrifice of the woman in his house. The businessmen spoke about profits and percentages, but he could only hear Grace's lullaby echoing in his mind. He realized he wanted to do something for her. The next evening, he returned earlier than usual. As he walked past the kitchen, he saw Grace sitting on a stool, eating quickly before hurrying to the baby's room. Her food was plain, just a little rice and vegetables. He stopped, watching quietly. She noticed him and stood up quickly, embarrassed, but he simply nodded and moved on. Inside, however, he felt a wave of guilt. He had dined in luxury restaurants his whole life, while the people working under his roof ate just enough to survive. Later that night, when the baby began crying again, Grace once more carried him to her small servant's room. She sat on the floor with the child in her lap, patting his back gently. Richard, unable to resist, stepped closer. He stood by the door and watched. Grace looked so tired, her body bent over, but her hands never stopped soothing the baby. Finally, after a long struggle, the child fell asleep in her arms. Richard turned away, his decision forming. He called his assistant the next morning and ordered something unusual, a comfortable bed, soft blankets, and a small crib. "Deliver them quietly," he said. "Place them in the maid's room when she is not there." His assistant raised an eyebrow but did not question him. When Grace returned to her room that evening, she stopped at the door in shock. There, against the wall, stood a brand new bed with fresh sheets. Beside it was a small crib, perfect for the baby. For a long time, she simply stood there, her hand covering her mouth. She could hardly believe what she saw. Who could have thought of her? Who would spend money for her comfort? She asked the other maids, but no one knew. They all looked just as surprised. That night, Grace sat on the edge of the bed and ran her fingers across the sheets. She had never slept on something so soft. Tears filled her eyes, but she quickly brushed them away. She was not used to receiving gifts. Still, in her heart, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks to whoever had thought of her. Meanwhile, Richard stood at his study window, watching the lights of the mansion. He knew she must have found the bed by now. He wondered what her reaction had been. Would she smile? Would she feel cared for, even if she did not know who gave it? He felt strangely happy knowing she had one less burden on her shoulders. Over the next few days, Richard continued to watch her in silence. He noticed she walked a little lighter now, though she never boasted about the bed or crib. She simply worked the same as before, humble, quiet, giving. He realized she would never ask for anything, no matter how hard life was. That made him respect her even more. One afternoon, the baby was restless again. Grace carried him in her arms, pacing the halls. Richard followed at a distance, unseen. She whispered to the child about her village, about her little brother, about the dream she carried in her heart that he would one day finish school and have a better life. Her voice was gentle, but her words were filled with longing. Richard stopped in his tracks, stunned. Until that moment, he had never heard her speak about herself. She lived for others, not for her own comfort. That night, Richard sat alone in his room, thinking deeply. He had built his empire on the idea that success was about power, numbers, and control. But here was Grace, teaching him silently that true wealth was measured in love, sacrifice, and dignity. He thought about the baby, how he laughed most when Grace was near, how he reached for her instead of anyone else. Richard realized that Grace was not just helping the baby sleep, she was shaping his child's earliest memories of love. The next morning, Richard asked the housekeeper about Grace. "Does she ever take breaks?" he asked. The housekeeper shook her head. "She works harder than anyone. She sends most of her pay back home. She never asks for more." That answer stayed with him. He went to his office in the mansion and sat with his pen in hand. For years, he had signed deals worth millions, but now he was thinking of something different. He wondered if he could somehow give back to Grace, not as charity, but as recognition for her heart. Meanwhile, Grace continued her routine, unaware of the thoughts circling in her employer's mind. She carried the baby, cleaned the house, and smiled at everyone, even when her own body was tired. She thought of the bed and crib each night and felt grateful, though she did not know who was behind the kindness. But Richard knew. And every time he passed her in the hallway, every time he saw her rocking the baby, he felt a quiet pride. He had taken the first step, giving her a little comfort. But deep inside, he knew it was only the beginning. Richard spent the next few days moving through his usual routine, but his thoughts were not the same. Meetings, phone calls, and contracts filled his calendar, but in the quiet moments his mind returned to that late night when he had seen Grace lying on the floor with his baby. The image was like a painting that refused to fade. He could still see the way her arm cradled the child, how her body bent into discomfort so the baby could rest in comfort. He had seen many things in his life: luxury, wealth, power, but that small act of sacrifice stayed with him more deeply than anything else. He wondered why it struck him so much. Perhaps because it reminded him of something he had long buried inside his heart, the memory of his mother. She had been a simple woman, nothing like the wealthy people Richard now surrounded himself with. She had worked long hours in a small bakery to support him, and he remembered her coming home tired yet always smiling. There were nights she fell asleep on the floor beside his bed when he was sick, refusing to leave his side. He had almost forgotten those moments, but Grace's act brought them rushing back. At breakfast, Richard found himself distracted. He would look at Grace quietly as she poured tea or served food. She did everything with care, never rushing, never complaining. She always made sure the baby was comfortable before she thought of herself. When the little boy fussed, she whispered softly to him, and Richard noticed the calm in her eyes. There was something pure and selfless about her presence. During a meeting at his office, Richard caught himself staring out the window, his mind drifting again. One of his business partners noticed and asked if he was unwell. Richard quickly shook it off, but inside he knew something was changing. The deals, the profits, the endless race for more, suddenly they felt heavy, almost meaningless compared to the small act of kindness he had seen in his own house. He began to notice other details he had never paid attention to before. Grace's shoes were worn out, the solace nearly breaking. Her clothes were neat but clearly old, mended several times at the edges. He realized she often ate standing in the corner of the kitchen, quietly taking whatever leftovers were available after everyone else was served. Yet, she never looked sad. She carried herself with quiet dignity, smiling when the baby reached for her or when another maid asked for help. One evening, the baby grew restless again. Richard, who had returned earlier than usual, sat in his study with a book. He heard the baby's cries echo down the hall and, instead of calling for the nanny, he followed the sound. He found Grace rocking the child back and forth, whispering a lullaby in her soft voice. Her voice was not trained or polished, but it carried warmth and love. The baby slowly calmed, his cries turning into small hiccups before he fell asleep against her shoulder. Richard stood quietly, hidden from sight, watching. He could not understand why his heart felt heavy. Was it guilt? Was it admiration? He was not sure. But he knew one thing: Grace's devotion was more genuine than most of the things he had witnessed in the glamorous world of wealth. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. And yet, she gave everything she had. That night, when Grace finally placed the baby in his crib and stepped out of the room, Richard went to his desk and sat in silence. He thought about his life, about how far he had come. He had everything: a mansion, cars, businesses across the globe. People bowed their heads when he entered a room. But did any of it matter when he could not even see the humanity of the people working under his roof? Grace had lived under the same roof as him for months, maybe years, and he had never truly seen her until now. In the days that followed, he began to test his own eyes. He noticed how the other staff treated Grace. Some looked down on her because she was quiet and poor. Others leaned on her, asking her for help whenever they struggled, because they knew she would never refuse. And Grace, she accepted it all without complaint, carrying the extra burden on her small shoulders. At times, Richard wanted to step in, to say something, but he remained silent. He was not ready yet. Instead, he began thinking of ways to change things quietly. He asked his assistant to order a new set of shoes in her size. He instructed the housekeeper to replace some of the old staff meals with healthier food. He even arranged for new blankets to be delivered, though he did not say for whom they were intended. Grace was surprised when she found a new pair of shoes placed outside her door. She looked around, confused, wondering who could have thought of her. She asked the other maids, but none of them knew. She assumed it must have been a mistake, but when she tried them on, they fit perfectly. For a moment, her eyes welled up, but she quickly brushed the tears away and returned to work. Richard watched all this quietly. He never told her it was him. He wanted to see how she would react. And when he saw her continue her work with the same quiet humility, wearing her new shoes without boasting, he felt something shift even more deeply in his heart. One night, the baby fell sick with a fever. The entire mansion was in panic. Doctors were called, medicines brought, but the baby cried endlessly. Grace, once again, was the one who carried him in her arms all night, wiping his forehead, singing softly, and refusing to rest. Richard stood by the door, watching her. His heart tightened as he saw her fight her own exhaustion to keep the baby calm. By dawn, the fever finally broke. The baby slept peacefully, his tiny hand clutching Grace's finger. She leaned against the chair, her eyes closing from fatigue, but her face was calm, almost glowing with relief. Richard turned away, his throat heavy with emotion. He walked back to his room and stood at the window, watching the sunrise. For the first time in years, he felt small tears sting his eyes. He realized the truth: it was not his money, his status, or his power that gave his baby peace, it was Grace. The woman he had barely noticed before was the one carrying the weight of love in the house. And for Richard, that truth was impossible to ignore. The billionaire walked beside her as they entered the building. He no longer looked like a man crushed by fear. He stood taller, his shoulders straight. He knew his fate would soon be decided, but he also knew he was not walking into battle alone. At his side was the maid, the same woman who once served quietly in his home, now serving boldly as his defender. Inside the courtroom, the tension was almost unbearable. The prosecutor wore a stiff expression. His pride had been wounded too many times, and today he was desperate to win. He brought forward his strongest arguments, stacking documents, calling for final witnesses, and painting a dark picture of the billionaire's actions. His voice thundered as he declared, "This man is guilty, and no speech from an untrained maid can change that." The audience held its breath. The judge's face was unreadable. The maid sat calmly, her hands resting on her folder. When the prosecutor finally sat down, exhausted from his long attack, the courtroom turned to her. Everyone wondered, would she still have the strength to answer? She stood up slowly. Her voice was soft at first but grew stronger with each word. "Your Honor, I have listened to every accusation. I have heard every word spoken against this man. But what I have not heard is truth. What I have seen are broken statements, twisted facts, and false witnesses. And today, I will show you why this case cannot stand." The audience leaned forward as she walked to the center. She began with the documents. Holding them up one by one, she pointed out errors, mismatched dates, and signatures that did not align. She explained each detail clearly, using simple words that everyone could understand. People in the back rows nodded as her explanations cut through the confusion. Then she turned to the witnesses. She reminded the judge how their testimonies had changed, how their statements clashed with records, how their words had crumbled under simple questions. "If the foundation of a house is cracked," she said, "the whole house will fall. And this case, Your Honor, is built on cracks." The prosecutor tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced him. "Let her finish," he said firmly. Now the maid's eyes softened as she turned toward the billionaire. She spoke not just to the judge but to everyone in the room. "I have worked in this man's house for many years. I have seen him not as a figure in magazines, not as a name in headlines, but as a human being. I have seen him treat his staff with kindness. I have seen him help strangers quietly when no one was watching. I do not stand here because I was ordered to. I stand here because I know his heart. And when you know the heart of a person, you know when lies are spoken against them." The billionaire lowered his head, fighting back tears. He had never felt so exposed, yet never so defended. The maid continued, her voice filled with strength. People laughed when I stood up and said, I will defend him. They called me foolish, they called me weak. But sometimes, the truth chooses the most unexpected voice. Sometimes, the one who seems small is the one who must rise. And today, I rise for justice. The courtroom was silent now. Even the prosecutor had no words to throw back. Everyone was caught in the force of her sincerity. She closed her folder and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, if justice is truly blind, then let it not be blinded by wealth, power, or appearances. Let it see only truth. And the truth is clear, this man is not guilty. The judge leaned back in his chair, his hands folded. The silence stretched long. Everyone waited. Finally, the judge spoke. His voice was deep and steady. I have listened to both sides. I have considered the evidence, the witnesses, and the arguments. And I have found that the prosecution has failed to prove its case. He paused, letting the words sink in. Therefore, I declare the defendant not guilty. The room exploded with sound. Gasps, cheers, and even tears filled the space. Reporters rushed out to deliver the news. The billionaire closed his eyes, relief washing over him like a flood. He turned to the maid, his voice breaking, You saved me. She shook her head gently. I only spoke the truth. The truth saved you. But he did not let her humility diminish the moment. He stood up in front of the whole courtroom, pointed to her, and said, This woman is my savior. When the world turned its back, she stood by me. She is more than a maid, she is a defender, a hero, and the reason I can walk free today. The audience erupted in applause. Some had tears in their eyes. Others whispered, She should have been a lawyer all along. After the trial, the billionaire kept his promise. He ensured that the maid was given the chance to return to school. He paid for her education, not as a reward but as an investment in someone he believed the world needed. She studied hard, just as she had always dreamed, and soon, she earned her place as a real lawyer. Years later, she became known not as a maid, but as one of the most respected defenders in court. People remembered her story, the day she stood in her simple uniform and spoke words that shook the walls of justice. She carried with her the same humility, never forgetting where she came from, but also never underestimating the strength she carried within. The billionaire often told others about her. Whenever someone asked him about the darkest time of his life, he would smile softly and say, The world thought I was finished. But one woman refused to let me fall. She did not wear a lawyer's suit. She wore courage. And that was enough to save me. Their story became an inspiration, told again and again. It reminded people that greatness does not always come from titles, wealth, or power. Sometimes, it comes from the courage of those who are overlooked, those who rise when no one expects them to. And so, the maid who once lived in the shadows became a light for many. Her voice, once ignored, became a symbol of truth. And her simple promise, I will defend him, echoed in the hearts of people everywhere as a lesson that justice belongs to those who dare to stand for it. Belief, others sneered, while a few looked on with quiet curiosity. Everyone expected the judge to dismiss her quickly, but instead, he allowed her to speak. That single moment changed the energy in the room. The next day of the trial brought even more people. News had spread quickly about the maid who stood up in court and declared she would defend the billionaire. The newspapers printed bold headlines. Reporters shouted questions outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed as soon as the billionaire and the maid arrived together. For many, it was unbelievable. How could a billionaire be relying on his maid in a case that could destroy his life? Some called it foolish, others called it inspiring. The fourth day of the trial began with even more tension than before. By now, the maid was no longer invisible. People came to the courthouse just to see her. Some wanted to support her, others wanted to see if she would finally break under the weight of the case. Reporters filled the steps of the building, microphones ready, cameras flashing. The story had spread beyond the city. Across the country, people were talking about the maid who dared to defend a billionaire when even his lawyer abandoned him. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was sharp. The prosecutor walked in with a determined look on his face. He had been embarrassed the last 2 days by her sharp questions and clear observations. Today, he wanted revenge. He was ready to throw every trick he had at her. His pile of documents was taller than ever, his tone sharper than a knife. He was not only fighting to win the case, but also to destroy her courage in front of everyone. The maid walked in quietly, carrying a thin folder in her hands. She did not need piles of papers. She carried notes she had made late into the night, with pages marked and underlined carefully. She was still in her simple uniform, her plain shoes making soft sounds against the polished floor. People whispered as she passed, some nodding with respect, others shaking their heads in doubt. The billionaire followed behind her, his face calm but his heart full of worry. He knew the battle was about to grow harder. He wanted to help her somehow, but he knew all he could do was sit beside her and trust her strength. The judge entered, and the trial began. The prosecutor rose and gave a long speech, waving his documents dramatically. He accused the billionaire of hiding money, of lying to his investors, of betraying trust. He spoke in complicated terms, filling the courtroom with heavy words designed to confuse and impress. Many in the audience looked unsettled, unsure if the maid could respond to such polished arguments. When the prosecutor finally sat down, he looked at her with a smug smile. "Now let's see what you can say to that," his eyes seemed to challenge. The maid stood slowly. She did not rush. She opened her folder, glanced at her notes, and then looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm and steady, "truth does not hide behind heavy words. It lives in the details. And today, I will show you those details." The courtroom leaned in closer. She started by addressing the first accusation. She showed how the dates the prosecutor mentioned did not match with bank records that were already in the file. She explained in simple language how a transaction could not have happened the way the prosecutor described. She did not use complicated terms. She explained it so that even someone sitting in the back row could understand. The prosecutor jumped up, interrupting. "Objection! She is not qualified to explain financial matters." The judge raised his hand. "Overruled. She is explaining facts, not opinions. Continue." The maid nodded politely and went on. She moved to the second accusation. She pointed out that one of the witnesses had changed his statement 3 times in 3 weeks. She asked why his story kept shifting if he was telling the truth. The audience murmured, realizing how strange that sounded. The prosecutor grew red in the face. He stood again and tried to throw more evidence at her. "Here are new documents, Your Honor," he said quickly. "Proof that the defendant moved money illegally." The judge handed the papers to her. She looked at them carefully, her eyes moving quickly across the pages. Then, in a calm voice, she said, "Your Honor, these documents cannot be trusted. Look at the stamp. It is dated 3 months after the event it is supposed to record. How can something be stamped before it even existed?" The courtroom erupted in gasps. Even the judge leaned forward to look at the stamp. The prosecutor's face froze. He had not expected her to notice so quickly. The billionaire turned to her, his eyes wide with amazement. She gave him a small, reassuring nod, as if to say, "Do not worry. I will not let them destroy you." But the prosecutor was not finished. He called for a surprise witness. The doors opened, and a man walked in. He was once a close business partner of the billionaire. His face was stern, his eyes cold. The prosecutor introduced him as the man who would finally confirm all the accusations. The audience buzzed with excitement. This was the moment the enemies had been waiting for. The witness took the stand and began speaking against the billionaire. He said the billionaire had betrayed him, had cheated, had made secret deals. His words sounded strong, and for a moment, it looked like the maid's defense might finally fall apart. But she listened carefully, writing notes as he spoke. When it was her turn, she walked slowly toward him. She asked him simple questions. At first, he answered confidently. But then, she asked about a specific date, a meeting he claimed to attend with the billionaire. She showed him a record proving that on that date, the billionaire was not even in the country. The witness stuttered, trying to cover his mistake. The audience gasped again. She pressed on, asking him about other details. Each time, she revealed another flaw in his story. The witness grew nervous, sweat forming on his forehead. Finally, the judge stopped him. Enough. Your testimony is unreliable. The prosecutor slammed his hands on the table, furious. The maid, however, remained calm. She turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, what you see today is not just a case against this man. It is a case built on lies, twisted stories, and false witnesses. But lies cannot stand when truth is spoken." The judge nodded slowly. "You have made your point clear." The billionaire sat beside her, his chest heavy with emotion. He could not believe how she had turned the case around again and again. His enemies had prepared traps, but she broke each one with her patience and sharp mind. By the end of the day, the courtroom was buzzing. Reporters wrote furiously, their stories already shaping into tomorrow's headlines. "The maid outsmarts the prosecutor," one whispered. "She defends with truth," another murmured. The billionaire leaned close to her as they left the courtroom. His voice was soft but filled with gratitude. "You are saving my life," he said. She looked at him with quiet strength. "I am not saving your life. I am saving the truth. And truth belongs to everyone." That night, the world outside was full of her name. People who had never met her were talking about her courage. Some called her a hero, others called her foolish, but no one could ignore her anymore. She was no longer just a maid in the shadows. She was a fighter standing in the light. The enemies of the billionaire met in private, worried and angry. Their simple plan to destroy him had turned into a battle they were not ready for. They knew the maid was dangerous because she was honest and fearless. They whispered, "We must find another way to break her." But the maid was not afraid. She had already faced laughter, doubt, and powerful men in suits. She had already proven herself. She knew the hardest battle was still ahead, but she also knew she was ready. The story was no longer only about the billionaire's trial. It was about courage, loyalty, and the strength of an ordinary woman who refused to step back. And as the court prepared for its final sessions, the world held its breath. Everyone wanted to know, could the maid finish what she started and truly defeat those who wanted the billionaire destroyed? Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavier than before. The prosecutor was more determined this time. He had prepared new arguments, and he carried a thick stack of documents. He wanted to crush the maid's confidence and prove that she was only wasting the court's time. He wore a proud smile as if victory was already in his hands. The billionaire sat down at his table, and beside him, the maid took her place. She was still wearing her simple uniform. She could have dressed differently, but she wanted the world to see her as she was an ordinary woman standing in an extraordinary moment. Her calm eyes scanned the room, and though she could feel the pressure, she refused to let fear control her. The judge entered, and the trial began. The prosecutor wasted no time. He stood up and started listing charges against the billionaire, painting him as a greedy man who had broken trust and law. His words were sharp, his tone strong, and many in the audience nodded along. For a moment, it seemed like the maid's voice would not be enough to stand against such polished arguments. But when it was her turn, she rose with quiet dignity. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she spoke slowly and clearly. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, let us not forget that justice is about facts, not appearances. It is about truth, not rumors. She then began to question the evidence. Piece by piece, she pointed out problems in the documents. She showed how one paper had a date that did not match with the records. She reminded the court of a witness statement that contradicted another. Her words were not fancy, but they were sharp like arrows hitting their mark. The prosecutor interrupted, "She is only a maid. What can she know of the law?" She turned to him and said softly but firmly, "A maid may not wear your suit, sir, but a maid can still see the dust in the corners others ignore." The courtroom fell silent for a second. Some gasped. Others smiled secretly, enjoying how she turned his insult into strength. Even the judge's lips curved slightly, though he quickly hid it under his stern expression. The billionaire watched in awe. He had always respected her hard work at home, but today he saw her in a new light. She was not just cleaning his house, she was now cleaning the lies thrown at him. Every word she spoke made him sit taller, made him feel less alone. But the struggle was far from easy. The prosecutor began calling witnesses. One after another, people came forward to speak against the billionaire. Some were business rivals who wanted to see him fall. Others were former employees who had been paid to twist the truth. Their voices were strong, and their lies were coated with just enough truth to sound believable. The maid listened carefully to each one. She wrote notes quickly, her hands moving faster than many expected. She caught small details others ignored. When it was her chance, she stood and questioned the witnesses. She did not shout or insult them. She simply asked questions that revealed cracks in their stories. One witness claimed he saw the billionaire sign a false document on a certain date. The maid asked him calmly, "Can you show the court the document you claim you saw?" The man hesitated, then admitted he had not actually seen it, only heard about it. Another witness accused the billionaire of moving money secretly. The maid asked him, "Do you have proof of this movement?" The man tried to answer, but the judge interrupted, saying, "Please answer directly." The man lowered his head and said no. With each question, the maid showed that the case was built more on rumors than on truth. The prosecutor grew angry. He slammed his papers on the table and said, "This is outrageous. She is not trained. She should not be allowed to question witnesses." But the judge looked at him and said, "What matters here is clarity. She asks clear questions, and I expect clear answers. That is justice." The audience was no longer laughing at her. They leaned forward with respect, listening to every word. Some even whispered, "She is brilliant." Others said, "She should have been a lawyer long ago." Still, the maid felt the weight of the battle. She knew she could not relax. The prosecutor had resources, connections, and years of experience. She only had her mind, her memory, and her courage. At night, she stayed awake, reading through old books, going through every page of the case files, preparing herself for the next day. Her eyes grew tired, but her heart stayed strong. The billionaire noticed her effort. One evening, as she sat at his kitchen table with piles of papers, he walked in. "You don't have to do all this," he said softly. "You've already done more for me than anyone else." She looked up and smiled. "I cannot stop now. If I stop, they will win with lies. And lies should never win." He sat down across from her, his voice heavy with emotion. "I once thought money could solve anything. But money left me alone. You, someone the world ignores, are giving me more than money ever could." Her eyes softened. Sometimes strength comes from places people least expect. The next day in court, she returned stronger. She carried a folder with notes she had written by hand. When the prosecutor tried again to twist facts, she opened her folder and calmly showed the judge the contradictions. She even surprised the prosecutor by quoting laws from memory, laws she had studied quietly over the years. The judge listened carefully. The balance of the case was beginning to shift. What looked like a simple victory for the prosecutor was now becoming a real fight. The maid was not only defending the billionaire, she was exposing flaws in the entire case. By the end of the third day, the courtroom was buzzing with a new kind of energy. People no longer called her just a maid. They called her the unexpected defender. Reporters wrote about her as the woman who turned a courtroom upside down. But deep inside, she knew the fight was not over. The prosecutor still had weapons to use. Powerful enemies still wanted the billionaire destroyed. She would need even greater courage to face what was coming next. As she walked out of the courthouse that evening, the cameras flashed again. A reporter shouted, "Why are you doing this? Why risk everything for him?" She paused, then answered with calm strength, "Because justice is not about who wears the finest suit. Justice is about who speaks the truth when no one else will." Those words echoed across the world. And everyone waited to see what would happen next. The billionaire sat there, his heart pounding, still stunned. He had lost all hope a few moments ago. The people he trusted were gone, and he thought he would face the storm alone. But when the maid spoke, something lit inside him. He looked at her and remembered the many small ways she had always been steady in his home. She never asked for much, she never complained, but now she was doing something no one else dared. For the first time in days, his shoulders felt a little lighter. The maid took a step forward, her shoes clicking softly on the courtroom floor. She faced the judge with calm eyes, though deep inside her chest her heart raced fast. She knew the risk. People could laugh at her, the judge could silence her, or she could make a mistake in front of everyone. But fear did not stop her now. She thought about how unfair it was to watch someone she knew as a good man sit helpless, abandoned like he was worth nothing. The judge cleared his throat. "You may proceed," he said firmly. The maid turned to the courtroom, and for a moment, there was silence. Every eye was on her. She began speaking slowly, carefully choosing her words. "I know I do not wear a lawyer's suit. I do not carry years of practice behind me. But I carry knowledge, and I carry truth. And truth, Your Honor, should never depend on how expensive your lawyer is." A ripple went through the audience. Some frowned, some raised eyebrows, but many listened. Her words struck a chord. She was not defending only the billionaire, she was also pointing at the weakness of a world where justice seemed reserved only for those with money. The billionaire's enemies, who sat a few rows back, whispered to each other angrily. They wanted him destroyed, and this unexpected defender irritated them. "This is ridiculous," one of them hissed. "She will fail in minutes." Another added, "Let her embarrass herself. It will make him look even worse." But the maid continued. She spoke of the billionaire's character not with fancy words, but with real examples from his life. She talked about the time he secretly paid for the hospital bills of an injured worker, the way he supported schools quietly without putting his name on them, and how he treated his staff with respect. Reporters typed quickly, their hands moving fast across their keyboards. They had expected a simple story of a billionaire's fall. Now, they were watching an unexpected twist that would make headlines even bigger. A maid defending her employer? This was the kind of story the world loved to read. As she spoke, the billionaire felt tears sting his eyes. He had forgotten how much the small, unseen people around him noticed. The maid remembered details he himself had overlooked. He realized she had been watching silently all these years, and she knew his heart better than many of his so-called friends. But not everyone in the courtroom was convinced. The prosecutor, a man who stood tall in a sharp black suit, smirked and shook his head. When the maid finished her first words, he rose. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he said coldly. "The defendant is being represented by someone with no license, no training, no authority. This is nothing more than a delay. The court should not waste its time." The judge looked thoughtful. The maid stood tall and replied before the judge could speak. "Authority is not only on paper. Sometimes authority comes from truth and courage. I may not have a license, but I have the knowledge to see what others ignored. And I have the courage to stand here when everyone else ran away. The judge tapped his pen slowly against his desk. He studied her, then the billionaire, then the prosecutor. Finally, he said, "For now, I will allow her to continue. But understand, this court demands substance, not speeches. If you cannot provide evidence or logic, your words will mean nothing." The maid nodded respectfully. "Understood, Your Honor." The prosecutor scoffed and sat back down. But his smile had faded. Something in the maid's voice unsettled him. She did not sound like someone unprepared. She sounded like someone who had thought deeply about this moment for a long time. The crowd leaned forward again, hungry for what would happen next. The maid's confidence began to grow. She looked through the case documents that had been left behind by the lawyer who ran away. She flipped the pages quickly, her eyes scanning with surprising sharpness. The billionaire leaned closer and whispered, You know how to read these." She gave him a small smile. "I used to dream of being a lawyer," she whispered back. "Life didn't allow it. But I never stopped learning." The billionaire stared at her in amazement. He had never known this part of her story. To him, she was the quiet woman who kept his home in order. Now, she was something entirely different, someone who might just save him. As the hearing continued, the maid asked to speak again. She pointed out flaws in the accusations made against the billionaire. She noticed dates that did not match, statements that contradicted each other, and documents that seemed suspiciously altered. She spoke slowly, making sure everyone could follow, even those without legal training. The audience began to murmur differently now. At first, they laughed at her. Now, they listened. Some even nodded quietly as she pointed out details they themselves had missed. The prosecutor grew restless. He stood again, throwing sharp arguments her way, but she did not back down. Her voice was calm, her tone steady. She reminded him of laws, quoting lines she had memorized long ago, and challenged him with questions he could not answer easily. The judge's eyes narrowed as he watched her. For years, he had seen many lawyers come and go, some brilliant, others lazy. But this woman, in her simple uniform, had a fire inside her words that he rarely saw even in professionals. She was not just defending her employer, she was fighting for something deeper. The billionaire sat quietly, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. He realized the trial was no longer only about him. It was about loyalty, about courage, and about how truth could come from the most unexpected places. The maid's presence gave him strength. He straightened his back, lifted his chin, and for the first time that day, looked his enemies in the eye without fear. At the end of the session, the judge declared that the trial would continue with further hearings. He did not dismiss the maid. Instead, he allowed her to prepare more evidence and come back stronger in the next round. The billionaire's enemies left the courtroom grumbling, angry that the easy victory they expected had slipped away. The maid walked back to her seat, her steps steady, her heart still beating fast but full of quiet pride. She knew the battle had just begun. This was only the start. But in her heart, she had already made a promise: she would not let him stand alone, no matter how many laughed or doubted her. The billionaire whispered as she passed him, "Thank you. You gave me hope again." She smiled softly and replied, "Hope is only the beginning. The truth will do the rest." The courtroom doors closed behind them, but the story had just opened. The world outside was waiting, and soon, everyone would hear about the maid who stood up and said, "I will defend him." At the very back of the room, almost hidden in the crowd, sat a woman in a plain uniform. She was the billionaire's maid. She had worked for his household for many years, cleaning, cooking, and looking after small tasks most people never noticed. She had seen his family in good times and bad. She had watched him work late nights, seen him care for his employees when no one was looking, and listened quietly when he thought he was alone and burdened. She knew more about him than anyone else in that courtroom, but no one ever noticed her. She sat there watching the man who had always treated her with kindness now left abandoned by everyone else. Her heart ached. She had not come to court as a witness or a lawyer, she had simply come because she wanted to show quiet support. She thought she would sit in the back, unseen, and pray silently for him. But now, as she saw him alone at the table, head bowed and shoulders heavy, something inside her changed. The judge's question echoed again, "Does no one wish to speak for him?" Still, silence. Reporters waited like hunters, ready to capture his defeat. The maid felt her hands trembling. She told herself, "I am just a maid. What can I do here?" But another voice inside her whispered, "If you do not stand up, he will be destroyed unfairly." Slowly, she rose from her seat. People turned, surprised, wondering why this ordinary woman would stand in the middle of such a powerful trial. She walked forward a few steps, her voice soft but clear. "I will defend him," she said. At first, her words seemed almost unreal, lost in the noise of the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow. "What did you say?" She took a deep breath. "I will defend him," she repeated, this time louder, her voice steady though her knees shook. The courtroom exploded in whispers and laughter. "A maid? Defend a billionaire," someone muttered loudly enough for others to hear. Another laughed, "She must be joking." The reporters scribbled quickly, delighted at this strange turn of events. The billionaire lifted his head in shock. He could not believe the person standing up for him was not a lawyer, not a friend, not a partner, but the woman who quietly polished the floors of his house. His eyes softened as he watched her walk forward with dignity, her uniform simple but her expression full of courage. The judge leaned forward. "Are you trained in law?" he asked. The maid hesitated. She had once dreamed of becoming a lawyer. In her youth, she studied passionately, but poverty had forced her to leave school. She had to work to survive, and that path had led her to housekeeping. Still, she never let go of her love for knowledge. She read books, studied cases, and followed trials whenever she could. She was no ordinary maid, she carried within her a sharp mind and a strong sense of justice. "I am not a lawyer," she admitted, her voice honest. "But I know this man. I know his truth. And I know enough to speak for him when no one else dares to." The courtroom grew quiet. Her words, simple but bold, touched something in the air. The judge studied her carefully. Normally, he would never allow someone without legal training to speak. But there was something in her voice, something in her eyes that showed sincerity and courage. The billionaire felt a mix of shame and gratitude. Shame because he, with all his wealth, had been abandoned by the people he thought he could trust. Gratitude because this humble woman, who owed him nothing, had stepped forward when the whole world turned away. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "Very well," he said slowly. "You may speak for him for now. But know that this court does not bend easily. If you waste our time, you will be removed." The maid bowed her head slightly, then lifted her chin with quiet strength. "I will not waste your time, Your Honor," she replied. The audience leaned forward, curious to see what would happen next. Some expected her to embarrass herself, others thought she would run out of words quickly. But the maid did not tremble anymore. She felt something powerful rise inside her. She was no longer just a worker in the shadows, she was now a defender standing in the light. The billionaire could only whisper, why would you do this for me?" She looked at him, her eyes steady. "Because everyone deserves someone to stand by their side when the world turns against them. You have always treated me with respect, and today I will not let you fall alone." In that moment, the courtroom no longer saw her as just a maid. She was something greater, someone who carried loyalty, knowledge, and courage in equal measure. The trial was no longer just about the billionaire's case. It was about the unexpected strength of a woman people thought was invisible. And so, in that crowded courtroom where the powerful had failed and the wealthy had deserted, a maid's voice rose to defend a billionaire. It was the beginning of a story no one could have predicted, a story that would be told again and again, the day an ordinary woman stood up and said, "I will defend him."